He thought I'd cry in court. I smiled and handed the judge the truth. So last month, I found myself sitting in a courtroom across from the man I once called my husband. Evan Carter. Even his name used to sound charming, smooth, like the kind of guy who'd order wine for you before you even looked at the menu. Now every syllable of his name makes my stomach turn. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint squeak of his leather shoes as he leaned back in his chair like he owned the place. He looked confident, polished, smug. And me? I just sat there, clutching an envelope in my lap. The same envelope that would eventually destroy every lie he'd ever told. But back then, he didn't know that yet. No one did. 3 years earlier, I never imagined it would come to this. Back then, I was just a nerdy woman who spent her nights coding and her mornings drinking bad coffee at my tiny office in Austin. I'd built a small app company from nothing. Just me, a secondhand laptop, and a dream so fragile it almost broke me more than once. I wasn't rich, not by Silicon Valley standards, but I was proud. Every dollar I made was earned, not handed to me. Then Evan showed up. I met him at a charity gala my friend dragged me to. I remember wearing a borrowed dress that barely fit and standing near the dessert table, pretending I wasn't completely out of place among all those rich donors. And then him. He had that movie star smile and this effortless charm that could melt ice. "You look like someone who'd rather be coding than socializing," he said, grinning. I laughed because he wasn't wrong. He told me he worked in real estate, investing in high-end properties, whatever that meant. He said he admired women who built things from scratch, and I swear my heart skipped a beat when he said, "You're not like the others here, Rachel. You actually work for your success." Yeah, he knew exactly what to say. We started dating, and he was everything a woman dreams of. Attentive, funny, ambitious. He brought flowers to my office, remembered my deadlines, even made me breakfast on Sundays. It felt like the universe was finally giving me a break after years of grinding alone. 6 months later, he proposed on a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city. The ring sparkled under the lights, and for a moment, I thought I'd won at life. I said yes. If only I knew that was the beginning of my downfall. The first few months of marriage were perfect. Too perfect. He'd always say things like, "I'm just so proud of you, babe," but then follow it with a jab like, "Though honestly, you're lucky that little app thing took off." I laughed it off at first. Thought it was just teasing, but the jokes became sharper, and his praise turned into passive-aggressive comments. He'd correct me in front of my employees, accidentally mention my mistakes during dinner parties, and sometimes he'd call my company a cute little side project. It stung, but I told myself marriage was about compromise. Then came the control. He wanted to help with the company finances, said he had business experience. Suddenly he was reviewing contracts, calling clients behind my back, and making decisions without asking me. One time, he even told my lead engineer, "You know, Rachel's great at ideas, but I'm the one who makes sure this company stays alive." I didn't confront him right away. I just went home, stared at myself in the mirror, and tried to understand how the same man who once said I inspired him now made me feel so small. But the worst part wasn't what he said. It was the way he looked at me while saying it. That half smile, that look of superiority, like he'd built me, not the other way around. Still, I kept quiet. I wanted to believe the man I loved was still in there somewhere, buried under ego and insecurity, until one night I overheard him on the phone. His voice was sharp, urgent. "I told you I'll get the money soon," he said. "She's got investments. She just doesn't know how much she owes me yet." My heart stopped. That was the night I realized my marriage wasn't love. It was a business deal I never agreed to. I didn't confront him that night. I just sat in the dark, listening to him talk, every word stabbing a little deeper. When he hung up and walked past me, I pretended to be asleep. He kissed my forehead, whispered, "Good night, babe," and I swear I've never felt so disgusted by a human touch in my life. I wanted to cry, but instead I smiled, because that was the exact moment I decided I wouldn't be his victim. I'd be his downfall. It's funny how you can share a bed with someone and still feel completely alone. That was me, about a year into my marriage. I'd lie there at night, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above me, pretending not to notice when Evan got out of bed to make late-night business calls. At first, I thought it was stress. He said he was trying to close a big real estate deal. But his voice, it always had this edge, this panic he tried to hide. Then one morning, I found an envelope in the mail addressed to Carter Holdings. It looked like a loan statement. I wasn't supposed to see it, but curiosity won. When I opened it, my hands went cold. $42,000, a credit line I'd never heard of. And the worst part? My company's name was listed as a guarantor. I waited until dinner to bring it up, thinking maybe there was an explanation. He was slicing steak when I slid the letter across the table. "You want to tell me what this is?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He barely glanced at it. "Relax, babe," he said, like I was overreacting about a parking ticket. "It's just a bridge loan for a client." "A bridge loan that uses my company as collateral?" I asked. He sighed, set his knife down, and gave me that condescending look, the one that made me want to throw something. "Rachel, you're overthinking again. You're good with code, not contracts. Let me handle this stuff, okay?" I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just said, "Sure, handle it," and I smiled. But inside, something in me broke. That night, I pulled out my laptop and checked our business accounts. There were transfers, small ones at first, then larger, thousands gone. My stomach twisted. I confronted him the next morning, and he flipped it like it was my fault. "You're obsessed with control," he said, pacing the kitchen. "You never trust anyone, not even your own husband." He was good, I'll give him that. He knew exactly which buttons to push, so I stopped arguing. I let him think he'd won. But I started documenting everything, screenshots, statements, even his late-night calls when he thought I was asleep. A week later, while cleaning his office, I found a manila folder under his printer. Inside were copies of my business contracts, and something else. Partnership agreements with both our names on them, signatures that looked eerily like mine. Only, I never signed those. My chest went tight. I remember whispering out loud, "Oh my God, he's really doing this." I didn't tell him what I found. Instead, I called someone I knew from a startup legal workshop, Dr. Grace Lynn. She was a forensic document analyst who used to work for the Texas Crime Lab before going private. When I told her what was happening, she didn't sound shocked, just sad. "You'd be surprised how often people forge the signatures of those they love," she said. We met in a coffee shop downtown, the kind of place where nobody pays attention to anyone. Grace wore glasses and spoke like a detective in a true crime documentary. I handed her the documents in a plain envelope. She took one look and said, "If these are fake, I'll find it." That night, I sat in my car outside my house for almost an hour before going in. The lights were on. I could see Evan moving around in the kitchen, humming to himself. I wondered how many other times he'd looked me in the eye and lied through those perfect teeth. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. A few days later, Grace called. "You were right," she said. "The ink's inconsistent, the paper stock is off, and the pen used wasn't even manufactured at the time these documents were supposedly signed." She paused. "Rachel, this wasn't a sloppy forgery. It was planned." I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just said, "Thank you." Then I hung up and stared out the window for a long time, thinking about every moment he'd made me doubt myself. Every time he said, "You're too emotional." Every time he called me paranoid. Turns out I wasn't paranoid. I was married to a con artist. Still, I played my part. I acted like nothing had changed. Made him breakfast, kissed him goodbye, laughed at his stupid jokes. He thought I was soft. He had no idea I'd already hired a private investigator to dig into his past. And what that man found made my blood run cold. 2 previous marriages. Both ended in financial settlements that left the women broke. One of them, Lauren, had owned a bakery in Dallas. Lost it after Evan drained her accounts through a joint venture. I found her Facebook profile, sent a message that just said, "Did he ever forge your signature?" She replied within an hour, "Yes, call me." We talked for 2 hours that night. She told me how he'd charmed her too, how he'd convinced her that love meant trust, then used that trust to ruin her. "He's a pattern," she said. "He studies people. Then he takes what he wants and moves on." When I hung up, I wasn't angry anymore. I was done being a victim. I wanted to be the last woman he ever tried to destroy. The next day, Evan walked into my office holding coffee and grinning. "Morning, boss lady," he said, kissing the top of my head like nothing was wrong. I smiled back and said, "Morning?" He had no clue that the walls were closing in. That week, Grace gave me a neatly sealed folder with her full report. "This is enough to bury him," she said. "But you'll have to be careful. If he suspects he might try to destroy evidence." I nodded. He won't suspect anything, I said, and I meant it. For the next few months, I played along. I let him believe he was in control. Let him mock me. Let him brag to his buddies about being the brains behind my company. Meanwhile, I was quietly working with my lawyer, collecting statements, preparing for what was coming. One night, over dinner, he said, "You know, Rach, you don't have to work so hard anymore. We'll be set for life once this divorce thing is over." He said it so casually, I almost laughed. Instead, I took a sip of wine and smiled. "Oh, I'm counting on it." He raised an eyebrow but didn't ask. Maybe he thought I was surrendering. Maybe he thought he'd broken me. The truth was, I'd never felt stronger. Because for the first time since I met him, I wasn't scared. I was ready. And Evan, poor guy, didn't know it yet. But his perfect plan was about to blow up right in his face. You ever watch someone dig their own grave and you just stand there, letting them keep going? That was me on the morning of our divorce hearing. I woke up at 5:30, made myself coffee, and sat in silence for a while. My lawyer, Daniel, had told me, "Keep calm, no matter what he says. He's going to try to get a reaction out of you." I promised I would, but deep down, I wasn't nervous. I was ready. When I walked into that courtroom, the air felt thick. Like everyone already knew this was going to be a show. Evan was there, of course, sitting with his lawyer, smirking like a man who'd already won. He was wearing a charcoal suit, gold watch flashing every time he moved his hand. I swear he practiced that look in the mirror. His lawyer kept patting his shoulder like, "You've got this." Meanwhile, I sat down quietly, with that same brown envelope in my lap, the one Grace had sealed herself and handed to me 2 nights before. The judge, a woman in her 50s with this no-nonsense energy, called the session to order. Evan's lawyer went first. He stood up, all confidence and showmanship. "Your Honor," he started, "my client, Mr. Carter, has been instrumental in the growth of his wife's company. We're simply here to ensure he receives fair compensation for his contributions." I almost laughed. Contributions? Yeah, like stealing from me counts as contribution. Evan leaned back, flashing me this smug little smile. Then he whispered something to his lawyer, who nodded and said, "In fact, Mr. Carter has documentation proving he was a legal partner in Novatech." The room shifted. I saw the judge raise an eyebrow, interested. And that's when Evan stood up. He cleared his throat like he was about to give a TED Talk. "Your Honor," he said, "I've supported my wife from day one. I helped her get investors, guided her through business decisions. Honestly, without me, that company wouldn't even exist." He paused dramatically, like he expected applause. "I think it's only fair I receive half of what we built together. After all, I gave up my own career to help her succeed." I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my reaction. I didn't give them one. I just sat there, hands folded, face calm. Inside, though, my blood was humming. Evan wasn't done. He smiled wide, teeth perfect, fake as hell, and added, "After today, I'll finally be able to live off her success, like I deserve." That line, that smug, stupid line. The courtroom actually went silent. Even the bailiff looked up. The judge tilted her head, and for a split second, I thought I saw her mouth twitch. Daniel leaned towards me and whispered, "Showtime." I stood up slowly. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge nodded. "I'd like to submit some additional evidence," I said, holding up the envelope. My voice didn't shake. I handed it to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. She opened it, pulled out the pages, and started reading. You could have heard a pin drop. After a few seconds, her eyebrows lifted. Then she looked at Evan. "Mr. Carter, these documents you provided as evidence of ownership. When did you say these were signed?" Evan straightened his tie. 2019, Your Honor, right before our seed funding round." The judge nodded, flipping to the second page. "Interesting, because according to this forensic report, the ink used in your signature wasn't manufactured until late 2021. You could actually hear the air leave his lungs." His lawyer stuttered, That can't be right." "Oh, it's right," the judge said flatly, still reading. "And the paper stock doesn't match standard issue legal stationery from that time either." She turned to me. "Mrs. Miller, who conducted this analysis?" I smiled just a little. "Dr. Grace Lynn, Your Honor, former forensic specialist for the Texas Crime Lab. Independent verification available if needed." The judge leaned back, clearly impressed. "Well, that's thorough." Then she turned to Evan. "Mr. Carter, is there anything you'd like to explain before I refer this to the district attorney's office?" He froze, completely pale. His jaw moved, but no sound came out. His lawyer whispered frantically, flipping through their documents like he could magically change the ink. And me, I just sat back and watched it happen. Months of pain, gaslighting, humiliation, all of it melting away as the truth finally surfaced. Then the judge sighed, a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. "This court does not tolerate fraud, Mr. Carter. Bailiff, please detain him for questioning regarding document falsification." The bailiff stepped forward, hand on his shoulder. Evan jerked back, eyes wide. "Wait, no, this is a mistake," he shouted. The room erupted, whispers, gasps, phones discreetly coming out to record. As they cuffed him, he turned to me, pure panic in his face. "Rachel, you set me up." I tilted my head, met his eyes, and said, "No, Evan, you set yourself up. I just let you talk." He kept yelling as he led him out, but I barely heard it. It was like the sound was underwater, fading into nothing. For the first time in years, I felt light. When the judge finally spoke again, she said, "Mrs. Miller, this court will finalize your divorce immediately. You are free of any financial ties to Mr. Carter, and for the record, good job protecting your company." That last line almost made me laugh. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. After the session ended, Daniel clapped me on the shoulder. "That was the cleanest takedown I've seen in 20 years, he said. "Remind me never to piss you off." I smiled. "Don't forge my signature and we'll be fine." As I walked out of the courthouse, the Texas sun hit me right in the face. It was blinding, but warm. I took a deep breath, tasted freedom in the air, that mix of coffee, dust, and victory. Behind me, reporters were already swarming, asking questions, snapping pictures. I didn't stop. I didn't need to say anything. The story would tell itself. Later that night, I went home, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat by the window. The city lights flickered outside like tiny stars. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who stayed quiet, who let someone make her feel small. She was gone. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Lauren, Evan's ex-wife. "Saw the news. Guess the universe finally got him." I smiled at the screen. "No," I typed back. "We did." Then I turned my phone off, leaned back, and laughed. Not out of joy, not out of spite, just relief. The kind that comes when you finally realize you don't owe anyone your silence anymore. And somewhere out there, I knew Evan was probably replaying that day in his head, wondering when exactly he lost control. The truth? It was the moment he underestimated me. The day the judge signed the final divorce papers, it didn't feel like victory. It felt quiet. You know that weird silence after a storm, when the air still smells like rain and burnt asphalt? That's what it was like. I walked out of the courthouse holding a single sheet of paper that said, in fancy font, "Marriage dissolved." Funny how years of love, lies, and chaos can shrink down to a few lines on official letterhead. Evan was gone, literally taken away in handcuffs, later charged with forgery and fraud. His lawyer tried to do damage control, saying it was a misunderstanding. Sure, because accidentally faking your wife's signature is something that just happens on a Tuesday. For weeks, I kept expecting to feel angry or vindicated or even proud. But mostly, I just felt tired, like my brain had been running a marathon for 3 years and finally hit the finish line. I stopped checking the news. I didn't want to see his face. Every article had some dramatic headline like, "Texas entrepreneur arrested in divorce scheme." They loved the drama. I was just trying to breathe again. One morning, I went back to my office for the first time since everything went down. The air smelled like fresh paint. We'd renovated while I was gone. My assistant Maya handed me a coffee and said, "Boss, it's good to have you back." That word, boss, hit differently now. For so long, Evan had tried to take that title from me, but now it was mine again, fair and square. I walked past the empty glass office that used to be his workspace. His stupid leather chair was still there, the one he insisted on buying because a CEO deserves comfort. I thought about throwing it out, but then I decided to keep it. Not as a reminder of him, but as proof that I could sit anywhere I damn well pleased. A few days later, I got an email from Lauren, Evan's first ex-wife. Subject line, "Coffee?" I almost ignored it, but curiosity got me. We met at a diner off I-35, the kind of place with peeling red booths and bottomless coffee that tastes like burnt rubber. When she walked in, she looked normal. Kind eyes, tired smile. She wasn't bitter, just older in the way people get when life's already broken them once. "I saw what happened," she said, stirring her coffee. "I wanted to tell you, I'm proud of you. You did what I couldn't." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and she went on. He did the same thing to me, you know. Signed my name on a business loan. I didn't fight it because I was scared. You weren't. That hit me hard, because I had been scared too, just differently. I wasn't fearless, I was exhausted, and sometimes exhaustion makes you brave. By the end of that lunch, we had an idea. We called it Rise Again, a small fund to help women, or anyone really, who'd been financially trapped or manipulated by partners. It started with a single GoFundMe link Lauren made on her phone right there in that diner. 2 weeks later, we had donations pouring in, messages from people all over the country. One woman wrote, "I thought I was alone until I heard your story." That's when it clicked for me. Maybe the whole nightmare wasn't just punishment. Maybe it was purpose. Back at Novatech, business started booming again. Investors who'd ghosted me during the divorce suddenly wanted meetings. A few even apologized for believing the wrong side. I smiled, shook their hands, but I never forgot the silence when I'd needed them most. Trust, I learned, doesn't come back once it's gone. It gets replaced by boundaries. Some nights, though, I still caught myself thinking about Evan. Not in a sad way, more like studying a scar. He'd always said I was too soft, that I'd never make it in the corporate world because I cared too much. Turns out, empathy's not weakness. It's armor. The kind that makes you human when everyone else is trying to play God. About 6 months later, I got a letter from the correctional facility. The return address made my stomach turn. I almost threw it out, but something made me open it. It was short, handwritten. "I'm sorry," it said. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you're doing well. You were the best thing that ever happened to me." I didn't reply. I just folded the letter and slid it into the drawer of that leather chair, the one he'd picked out, and whispered, "I am doing well, better than ever." On the anniversary of the divorce, Lauren and I hosted a small event for Rise Again. A local reporter came to cover it, and before she left, she asked, "If you could tell your younger self one thing, what would it be?" I laughed and said, "Read the fine print, in business and in love." Everyone chuckled, but there was truth in it. Because love, real love, doesn't ask you to shrink so someone else can shine. That night, after the event, I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon. Texas night sky above me, quiet, wide, endless. I thought about the woman who'd once believed she needed saving, and I realized I didn't need saving. I just needed to remember who I was before he made me forget. The cicadas were loud, the air smelled like cedar, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Not the kind of freedom you celebrate with champagne, the quiet kind, the kind that hums in your bones and whispers, "You made it." And I did. It's strange how life circles back. 2 years after everything ended, I found myself standing on the same courthouse steps where my whole world had collapsed. Only this time, it wasn't for me. One of the women from Rise Again, a nurse named Jamie, was finalizing her own divorce. She hugged me and whispered, "You made me brave." That line stuck with me the entire drive home. Because the truth is, I wasn't brave back then. I was broken. I just didn't stay that way. People always ask if I'd do it all again, if I'd still marry Evan knowing how it would end. And as crazy as it sounds, I think I would. Not because I miss him, God no, but because that storm built a version of me that I never would have met otherwise. The kind who doesn't apologize for taking up space, who doesn't confuse kindness with weakness, who finally understands that no is a full sentence. I still live in the same little house on the edge of Austin, same porch swing, same oak tree in the yard that drops leaves like it's allergic to being tidy. But the air feels different now. Lighter, there's laughter again, music sometimes. On Sundays I bake, not because I have to, but because I want to. Freedom, I've learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it smells like cinnamon rolls at 8 a.m. Every so often, I get a letter from someone who's heard my story online. One woman wrote, "You made me realize that leaving isn't losing. It's choosing yourself." That one made me cry, not the ugly cry, just the quiet kind, where you smile through it because you finally get it. A few months ago, I was invited to speak at a local university about women in tech. Standing there, looking out at a room full of 20-somethings with big dreams and too much caffeine, I told them what I wish someone had told me. You don't have to be liked to be respected, and you don't owe anyone your silence, especially not the people who benefit from it. The room went dead quiet for a moment. Then someone started clapping. It wasn't dramatic, just genuine, like they understood. Afterward, a student came up to me, this shy girl with blue hair and trembling hands, and said, My boyfriend keeps telling me I'm not smart enough to start my own business. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Then start it twice as fast." She laughed through her tears. I guess that's the thing about pain. When you turn it into fuel, it burns clean. The Rise Again Fund kept growing. What started as a GoFundMe turned into a full nonprofit, with volunteers across 5 states. Lauren and I still run it together. Sometimes we fight about little things. She wants modern branding, I want to keep it scrappy. But we always end up laughing over iced lattes and old war stories. It's wild to think we met because of the same man who tried to ruin us. He taught us everything he didn't mean to. How to build, how to rebuild, and how to never, ever doubt our worth again. As for Evan, last I heard, he was out on parole, working some low-level job in Oklahoma. Sometimes people expect me to gloat, but honestly, I don't feel anything. He's just a chapter I outgrew. And maybe that's the real revenge, peace. Because when you finally stop carrying what broke you, you start to fly. The other night, I sat on that same porch swing with a glass of sweet tea and watched the sunset bleed into the Texas hills. My neighbor's kid rode his bike past, waving, shouting, "Miss Rachel, are you rich now?" I laughed so hard I almost spilled my drink. "Depends," I said. "If peace counts, then yeah, I'm filthy rich." Sometimes I still catch the echo of the old me, the one who hesitated, who tried to be small so someone else could feel big. She still whispers sometimes, "What if it happens again?" And I tell her, "Then we'll survive it again, but smarter, because the goal was never perfection, it was freedom." There's a framed quote in my office now right above my desk. It says, "She believed she could, but she also hired a lawyer." Makes everyone laugh when they see it, but to me, it's sacred. A reminder that belief means nothing without action. When I think about it all, the courtroom, the humiliation, the sleepless nights, I don't feel bitterness anymore, just gratitude. Because everything that was meant to break me ended up building the woman I actually wanted to be. The kind who no longer flinches when life tests her. The kind who looks in the mirror and sees not the victim, not even the survivor, but the author. So yeah, maybe this isn't a fairy tale. There's no prince, no castle, no happily ever after. But there's something better, peace, purpose, and a life that finally feels like my own. And that's enough. More than enough. You know, if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that silence can be the most dangerous kind of cage. For years, I thought keeping the peace meant staying quiet, letting things slide, pretending I was fine. But peace built on fear isn't peace at all. It's surrender. And once you start believing that your voice doesn't matter, someone else will use that silence to write your story for you. Walking away wasn't the hard part. Believing I deserved better, that was. Because when you've spent enough time being made to feel small, freedom can feel like guilt. But life has this funny way of proving that what's meant for you won't pass you by. Every time I spoke up, every time I stood my ground, the world got a little quieter, and my heart got a little louder. In the end, justice didn't come from revenge. It came from reclaiming my own narrative. It came from knowing that dignity doesn't need to shout, and that kindness, when paired with strength, can move mountains. Like they say, the truth may walk slowly, but it always reaches its destination. So if you're listening to this and you're stuck in a place where you feel unseen, unheard, or underestimated, don't shrink. Don't wait for permission to be who you are. Stand tall, even if your voice shakes, because the world doesn't need a quieter you. It needs a truer you. What about you? Have you ever had to walk away from something or someone to finally find yourself again? I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories that remind us. No matter how dark it gets, light always finds its way back. Until next time, take care of your heart and keep walking toward peace.